The late October sun hung low over Piedmont Park, casting a golden glow across the sprawling green expanse in the heart of Atlanta. Leaves, crisp and brittle, pirouetted through the air, carried by a gentle breeze that rustled the ancient oaks lining the pathways. It was the kind of afternoon that begged for stillness, a rare pause in a city that pulsed with restless energy. Isaiah Jackson sat alone on a weathered wooden bench near the park's northern edge, a thick law book cradled in his lap. His dark suit jacket was folded neatly beside him, sleeves rolled up to his elbows, revealing forearms taut from years of discipline. At 42, Isaiah carried himself with the quiet authority of a man who'd clawed his way up from nothing to become one of Atlanta's most formidable federal prosecutors. His sharp brown eyes flicked across the page, but part of him remained attuned to the world around him, a habit forged in courtrooms and crime scenes where missing a detail could cost everything. Across the park, Officer Ryan Callahan trudged along his usual patrol route, his boots scuffing against the gravel path. 20 years on the force had etched lines into his weathered face, and his broad shoulders bore the weight of countless nights spent chasing shadows through Atlanta's underbelly. His blue eyes, narrowed beneath the brim of his cap, swept the area with practiced vigilance. Ryan prided himself on his instincts, those gut feelings that told him when something was off, when someone didn't belong, and right now those instincts were screaming. His gaze snagged on Isaiah, sitting there, too composed, too solitary. The man's stillness unsettled him. Piedmont Park was a haven for joggers, families, and hipsters sipping overpriced coffee, not for lone figures in pressed shirts who looked like they were waiting for something to happen. Ryan's jaw tightened as he slowed his pace, his hand brushing the cuffs on his belt. He'd been on edge all week. A string of break-ins in Midtown had the department buzzing, the suspect descriptions maddeningly vague. Male, black, athletic, late 30s to early 40s. It wasn't much, but it was enough for Ryan to build a picture in his mind. A picture that, whether he admitted it or not, had been shaped by years of arrests, headlines, and a childhood spent in a neighborhood where trust was a luxury he couldn't afford. He muttered under his breath, "Not on my watch," as he veered toward the bench. Isaiah sensed the shift before he saw it, the prickling awareness of being watched. He glanced up, his eyes locking onto Ryan's, with a clarity that cut through the officer's bravado. In that split second, Isaiah knew what was coming. He'd seen that look too many times. Suspicion masquerading as duty, a judgment made before a single word was spoken. Ryan stopped a few feet from the bench, his shadow falling across Isaiah like a storm cloud blotting out the sun. "Afternoon," he said, his voice clipped, laced with an edge that didn't invite pleasantries. Isaiah closed his book slowly, marking the page with a finger, and met Ryan's stare with a calm that only deepened the officer's unease. "Afternoon, officer," Isaiah replied, his tone smooth as polished steel. Ryan's eyes flicked to the book, then back to Isaiah's face, searching for a crack in the man's composure. "Mind telling me what you're doing here?" he asked, his fingers twitching at his side. Isaiah arched a brow, a faint smile tugging at his lips. "Reading, enjoying the day. Is that a problem?" The words were measured, but beneath them simmered a quiet defiance that Ryan didn't miss. The officer's patience frayed like a worn rope. "You from around here?" he pressed, stepping closer. Isaiah's smile faded, replaced by a colder glint in his eyes. "I've been around," he said, deliberately vague. Ryan's gut twisted. He'd heard that kind of dodge before, from perps who thought they could outsmart him. "I'm going to need to see some ID," he snapped, his tone hardening. Isaiah didn't flinch. "Am I under arrest?" he asked, his voice steady, cutting through the air like a blade. Ryan bristled, his hand hovering near his holster. "You will be if you don't cooperate," he shot back. For a long moment the two men stared each other down, the tension crackling between them like static before a lightning strike. A few park-goers slowed their pace, casting curious glances, but Ryan barely noticed. His world had narrowed to the man on the bench, the man who wouldn't bend. Isaiah sighed, a sound heavy with resignation. He knew this script, had lived it too many times in too many places. He could recite his rights, push back, escalate this into a legal standoff. But he also knew how fast these moments could spiral, how a refusal could turn into a headline he didn't want. Fine, he said, reaching into his pocket with deliberate slowness, making sure Ryan saw every move. He handed over his ID, his gaze never wavering. Ryan snatched it, scanning the name, Isaiah Jackson, and the title that followed. His smug certainty flickered, but he shoved it down. Stand up, he ordered, pulling the cuffs from his belt. Isaiah rose, towering over Ryan with a quiet dignity that made the officer's chest tighten. Turn around, Ryan barked, his voice louder now, as if volume could mask the doubt creeping in. As the cold metal clicked around Isaiah's wrists, a small crowd gathered nearby, whispers rippling through them. Among them, a boy no older than 10 fumbled with his phone, the camera lens catching the glint of sunlight off the handcuffs. Ryan gripped Isaiah's arm, leading him toward the patrol car parked near the park's edge, oblivious to the storm he'd just ignited. Isaiah didn't resist, but his silence carried a weight that promised consequences far beyond this moment. The patrol car's back seat was a frigid cage, the vinyl seat creaking under Isaiah Jackson's weight as Officer Ryan Callahan slammed the door shut. The air inside smelled faintly of stale coffee and disinfectant, a stark contrast to the crisp autumn breeze swirling through Piedmont Park just beyond the tinted windows. Isaiah adjusted his posture, the handcuffs biting into his wrists, but his face remained a mask of unshakable calm. Through the glass, he watched the golden leaves dance across the park's pathways, their carefree motion mocking the absurdity of his situation. He'd been here before, not in cuffs, not like this, but in moments where his skin alone made him a target. Years of prosecuting corrupt cops and dismantling criminal empires had taught him patience, but it didn't dull the quiet burn of frustration simmering beneath his composure. Ryan slid into the driver's seat, his knuckles whitening as he gripped the steering wheel. The smug certainty he'd felt in the park was unraveling, thread by thread, replaced by a gnawing unease he couldn't name. This guy wasn't right, too steady, too unbothered. Most people squirmed when cuffed, pleaded their case, or at least glared with defiance. Isaiah did none of that. He just sat there, staring out the window like he was waiting for something inevitable. Ryan's eyes flicked to the rearview mirror, catching Isaiah's gaze for a split second. A look so piercing, it sent a shiver down his spine. You got something to say back there? Ryan snapped, his voice sharper than he intended. Isaiah turned his head slowly, meeting Ryan's stare through the mirror. Not yet, he said, his tone cool and deliberate. But I will. Ryan scoffed, turning the key in the ignition. Yeah, we'll see about that. The engine roared to life, and the car lurched forward, weaving through the park's edge toward Midtown Atlanta's bustling streets. His mind raced, replaying the encounter. The guy fit the profile, black, athletic, alone in a high-crime area. It wasn't a stretch, not with the break-ins plaguing the precinct's radar. But something about Isaiah's demeanor gnawed at him, a splinter of doubt lodging deeper with every passing block. He tightened his grip on the wheel, forcing the thought away. He'd been right before. His instincts had saved lives, closed cases. This was no different, or so he told himself. The precinct loomed ahead, a squat brick building dwarfed by the glass towers of Midtown. Ryan pulled into the lot, killing the engine with a flick of his wrist. He climbed out, boots hitting the pavement with a heavy thud, and yanked open the back door. Out, he barked, gesturing for Isaiah to move. Isaiah complied, stepping onto the asphalt with a grace that belied the cuffs on his wrists. His eyes swept the precinct's facade, then settled on Ryan with a look that promised trouble. Not the loud, chaotic kind, but the slow, deliberate sort that could unravel a man's career. Ryan felt it in his gut, a cold twist he couldn't shake as he marched Isaiah through the precinct's double doors. The precinct's interior buzzed with the low hum of activity, phones ringing, officers murmuring over steaming mugs of coffee, the clatter of keyboards echoing off the scuffed linoleum floors. Ryan guided Isaiah through the chaos, his grip tight on the prosecutor's arm, though Isaiah's steady stride made the effort feel unnecessary. Heads turned as they passed, a ripple of curiosity spreading through the room. Ryan ignored it, his focus locked on the processing desk ahead, where Officer Jamal Carter, a wiry rookie with a perpetually nervous grin, stood shuffling paperwork. Got a suspect here, Ryan said gruffly, shoving Isaiah's ID onto the counter. Run it. Jamal nodded, his fingers fumbling over the keyboard as he scanned the card. Ryan crossed his arms, leaning against the desk, his chest puffed with the certainty of a man who'd done this 1,000 times before. Isaiah stood silently beside him, his cuffed hands resting in front of him, his gaze drifting across the precinct like a predator sizing up its territory. He caught the flicker of recognition in Jamal's eyes before Ryan did. A widening of pupils, a sharp intake of breath. The rookie's fingers froze mid-keystroke, his mouth parting as he stared at the screen. Callahan, Jamal's voice cracked, barely above a whisper. Ryan frowned, impatience flaring. What? Spit it out. Jamal swallowed hard, turning the monitor slightly so Ryan could see. The screen glowed with Isaiah's credentials. Isaiah Jackson, Assistant U.S. Attorney, Federal Prosecutor, Atlanta District. Ryan's smirk vanished, the blood draining from his face as the words sank in. His breath hitched, a cold sweat prickling at his temples. He just cuffed a Fed, a damn prosecutor, and not just any prosecutor, but one who specialized in torching dirty cops. For a moment, the precinct's noise faded to a dull roar in Ryan's ears. He snatched the ID back, staring at it as if it might change under his glare. This can't be right, he muttered, more to himself than anyone else. Isaiah tilted his head, his voice cutting through the haze like a blade. It's right, Officer Callahan, and you're about to find out just how right it is. Ryan's head snapped up, meeting Isaiah's eyes, steady, unyielding, and laced with a quiet fury that made his stomach drop. He opened his mouth to retort, but the words died in his throat as heavy footsteps approached from the hallway. Captain Lorraine Hayes emerged like a thundercloud, her broad frame filling the doorway. Her dark eyes swept the scene, Isaiah in cuffs, Ryan pale and rigid, Jamal shrinking behind the desk, and her lips pressed into a thin, dangerous line. Callahan, she said, her voice low and lethal. My office. Now. She didn't wait for a response, turning on her heel with a curt nod to Isaiah. You too, Mr. Jackson. Ryan's heart pounded as he followed, the weight of his mistake crashing down like a tidal wave. Whatever came next, he knew one thing for certain. The storm he'd started was only just beginning. The door to Captain Lorraine Hayes' office clicked shut with a sound that reverberated like a gavel striking wood, sealing Officer Ryan Callahan's fate in the stifling silence that followed. The room was a fortress of order, files stacked neatly on the desk, commendations framed on the walls, a stark contrast to the chaos brewing inside Ryan's chest. Lorraine stood behind her desk, her arms crossed, her dark eyes boring into him with the intensity of a predator sizing up its prey. Isaiah Jackson stood to the side, still cuffed, his posture relaxed but his presence commanding, a silent storm waiting to break. Ryan shifted his weight, sweat beating at his temples despite the chill of the air conditioning. He'd faced reprimands before. 20 years on the force guaranteed that, but nothing like this. This felt personal, final, like the ground was crumbling beneath him. Sit, Lorraine ordered, her voice a low growl that brooked no argument. Ryan obeyed, sinking into the chair with the stiffness of a man awaiting execution. Lorraine didn't sit. She loomed, her shadow stretching across the desk as she pressed a button on her laptop. The screen flickered to life, displaying grainy footage from Ryan's body cam. The timestamp glowed in the corner. 3:47 p.m., Piedmont Park. The audio crackled as Ryan's voice filled the room. Mind telling me what you're doing here? Followed by Isaiah's calm, measured response. Every word, every movement played out in excruciating detail. The demand for ID, the escalation, the cuffs snapping shut. Ryan's stomach twisted as he watched himself, the smug tilt of his head, the way he dismissed Isaiah's dignity with a flick of his wrist. It looked worse than he remembered, harsher, uglier. Lorraine paused the footage, freezing on the moment Isaiah handed over his ID. Explain this to me, Callahan, she said, her tone dangerously even. Explain how you went from a routine patrol to cuffing a federal prosecutor without a shred of probable cause. Ryan opened his mouth, but the words caught in his throat, dry and useless. I I thought he fit the description. He managed, his voice hoarse. The break-ins, male, black, athletic build. He was alone, acting suspicious. Lorraine's eyes narrowed, a flash of disgust cutting through her composure. Suspicious? She repeated, her voice rising. He was reading a damn book in a public park. You call that suspicious? Ryan flinched, his hands clenching into fists on his lap. He wanted to argue, to defend the instincts that had carried him through 2 decades, but the footage mocked him, exposing the flimsiness of his excuse. Isaiah finally spoke, his voice slicing through the tension like a blade through silk. It's not just about me, Captain Hayes, he said, his gaze shifting from the screen to Ryan. It's about what he saw before he even approached me, and we all know what that was. The words landed like a punch, stripping away Ryan's last shred of denial. Lorraine exhaled sharply, rubbing her temples. You're on administrative leave, effective immediately, she said, her tone final. This isn't over, Callahan. Not by a long shot. The air in Captain Lorraine Hayes's office grew heavier as the echo of her words, "This isn't over," hung between them. Ryan Callahan sat frozen, his mind scrambling for a lifeline. But the walls seemed to close in tighter with every breath. Lorraine turned away from him, her attention shifting to a blinking light on her desk phone. She pressed the speaker button, and Officer Jamal Carter's voice crackled through, tentative and strained. Captain, we've got something you need to see. It's from the park. Lorraine's brow furrowed, a flicker of unease crossing her face. Send it through, she said, her tone clipped. Ryan's pulse quickened. He didn't know what was coming, but the dread pooling in his gut told him it wasn't good. A moment later, the laptop screen blinked, replacing the body cam footage with a new video. The angle was shaky, amateurish, clearly shot from a phone. The timestamp matched the arrest, 3:49 p.m., Piedmont Park. Ryan recognized the scene instantly. The bench, the golden leaves, Isaiah standing with his hands raised as Ryan approached. But this wasn't his footage. This was from the crowd, the boy with the phone, capturing what the body cam couldn't. The audio hit like a freight train. Ryan's voice, louder and rawer than he'd remembered, barking, "You think you're smarter than me, huh? People like you always do." The slur wasn't explicit, but the venom in people like you was unmistakable, dripping with a prejudice Ryan hadn't even realized he'd let slip. The room went deathly silent, the weight of those words suffocating. Isaiah's expression didn't change, but a muscle in his jaw twitched, the only sign of the storm beneath his calm. Lorraine's face hardened, her eyes blazing as she turned to Ryan. "You want to tell me that's not what it looks like?" she demanded, her voice trembling with barely contained rage. Ryan's mouth went dry, his mind reeling. I didn't mean it like that," he stammered, but the lie tasted bitter on his tongue. He couldn't unhear it, couldn't unsee the way he'd loomed over Isaiah, his stance radiating aggression he'd never questioned until now. Lorraine slammed her hand on the desk, the sound jolting Ryan upright. "You didn't mean it," she snapped. "That tape's going to internal affairs, Callahan. And when it leaks, and it will leak, this precinct's going to be a damn circus." Isaiah stepped forward, his voice low but cutting. "This isn't just about him, Captain. It's about how many times this happens when no one's filming." Lorraine met his gaze, nodding grimly. "You're right, and I'm sorry it happened to you." She turned back to Ryan, her decision final. "Get out of my sight. You're done here until I say otherwise." Ryan rose, legs trembling, and stumbled toward the door. As he reached for the handle, Isaiah's voice stopped him cold. "You're lucky it was me, Officer Callahan," he said softly. "Next time, it might not be." Ryan didn't turn back. He couldn't, but the words followed him out, a warning that promised a reckoning far beyond the precinct walls. The streets of Atlanta buzzed with a restless energy as dusk settled over the city, painting the skyline in hues of orange and purple. News vans lined Peachtree Street, their satellite dishes piercing the sky like sentinels, while clusters of protesters gathered outside the Midtown precinct, their signs bobbing in the cool evening air. Justice for all. No more bias. Who watches the watchman? The grainy video from Piedmont Park had spread like wildfire across social media within hours of Ryan Callahan's confrontation with Isaiah Jackson. each share amplifying the outrage. By morning, every local station had looped the footage. Ryan's voice snarling, "People like you," as he cuffed a man who turned out to be one of Atlanta's top federal prosecutors. The city was a powder keg, and the spark had just been lit. Inside the newsroom of the Atlanta Chronicle, Maya Torres hunched over her desk, her dark eyes scanning the flood of emails and tips pouring in. A seasoned investigative journalist with a reputation for unearthing corruption, Maya had known Isaiah since their college days at Morehouse, where they'd bonded over late-night debates about justice and power. She'd gotten wind of the arrest from a source in the precinct, a jittery clerk who'd overheard the chaos, and within hours her byline was plastered across the front page. Federal prosecutor wrongfully arrested, a case of bias or bad policing? The article didn't just report the facts, it dissected them, quoting Isaiah's calm defiance and Ryan's venomous slip, framing the incident as a glaring symptom of a deeper rot. Maya's phone buzzed incessantly. Editors, activists, even a cryptic text from Isaiah. "Stay sharp. This is bigger than me." She smirked, cracking her knuckles. He didn't need to tell her twice. Outside the precinct, the crowd swelled, their chants echoing off the brick walls. A young woman with a megaphone led the charge, her voice raw with fury. "We're tired of excuses. No badge should mean a free pass." Cameras flashed as reporters jostled for shots of the growing protest, the air thick with tension and the scent of rain on the horizon. Inside his cramped apartment a few miles away, Ryan sat slumped on a threadbare couch, the TV flickering with his own face staring back at him. The remote trembled in his hand as he watched the anchor dissect his career in real time. Officer Ryan Callahan, a 20-year veteran, now at the center of a firestorm. He hurled the remote across the room, the plastic shattering against the wall with a hollow crack. The screen didn't flinch, the headlines rolling on. Racial bias alleged in shocking arrest. Ryan's breath came in shallow bursts, his chest tight with a mix of anger and dread. He'd wanted to be the hero, the cop who kept the streets safe, but now he was the villain in a story he couldn't control. The phone rang, his precinct line, but he let it go to voicemail, knowing it was probably another reporter, or worse, Captain Hayes with more bad news. He buried his face in his hands, the weight of the day crashing down, unaware that the storm outside was only a prelude to the one brewing within. The flickering glow of the TV cast jagged shadows across Ryan Callahan's apartment. The muted hum of the newscast, a relentless drone beneath the pounding in his skull. He stumbled to the kitchen, yanking open the fridge to grab a beer, but his hand froze mid-reach as the anchor's voice cut through. "Sources confirm the officer's body cam footage has been submitted to Internal Affairs, with a leaked bystander video adding fuel to allegations of racial bias." Ryan slammed the fridge door shut, the glass bottles rattling inside, and snatched a half-empty whiskey bottle from the counter instead. He poured a shaky shot, the amber liquid sloshing over the edge, and downed it in one gulp. The burn did nothing to dull the panic clawing at his chest. That damn kid with the phone. He hadn't even noticed him in the park, too caught up in his own certainty. Now that moment was his undoing, replayed on every screen in Atlanta. Outside, the city churned. Maya Torres stood on the precinct steps, her recorder in hand, interviewing a protester whose voice trembled with emotion. "My brother got stopped last week for nothing, just walking home. This isn't new. It's just caught on camera now." Maya nodded, her jaw tight, scribbling notes as the crowd's chants swelled behind her. She'd already filed a follow-up piece, this one sharper, linking Isaiah's arrest to a pattern of stops in Midtown's black neighborhoods. Her phone buzzed again, another tip, this time from a precinct insider claiming Ryan had a history of overzealous patrols. Maya's eyes narrowed. She'd dig deeper, but for now the story was breaking wide open. Back at her desk, she'd seen the numbers. Hashtag Justice for Isaiah, trending with over 50,000 tweets, a petition for Ryan's badge gaining traction. The pressure wasn't just on Ryan, it was on the entire department, and Captain Hayes knew it. Ryan's apartment felt like a cage, the walls pressing in as the whiskey bottle emptied. He flipped through channels, each one a variation of the same nightmare. Pundits debating his motives, activists calling for reform, a grainy still of him cuffing Isaiah plastered across the screen. His phone buzzed again, this time a text from an unknown number. "You're finished, Callahan. Watch your back." His heart lurched, fingers fumbling to block the number, but the threat lingered like a ghost. He staggered to the window, peering through the blinds at the street below. A news van idled across the road, its crew filming the building. Ryan jerked back, cursing under his breath. They'd found him already. A sharp knock at the door jolted him upright, the sound like a gunshot in the silence. He hesitated, pulse racing, then crept forward, peering through the peephole. Tommy Callahan stood there, his younger brother's lean frame slouched against the jamb, eyes shadowed with something Ryan couldn't place. Anger, maybe, or pity. Ryan unlatched the door, stepping aside as Tommy entered without a word. The air between them crackled, thick with unspoken history, and Ryan braced himself for what was coming. The world outside was loud, but the reckoning inside these walls would be louder still. The dim light of a single bulb flickered overhead in Ryan Callahan's cramped apartment, casting jagged shadows across the peeling wallpaper. The air smelled of stale whiskey and regret. The empty bottle tipped over on the counter, a testament to the night's unraveling. Ryan sat hunched on the edge of his couch, his uniform crumpled in a heap by the door, the badge he'd once worn with pride now buried beneath it, like a discarded relic. Tommy Callahan stood across the room, his lean frame taut with tension, hands shoved deep into the pockets of his worn jacket. At 32, Tommy was a decade younger than Ryan, but the lines etched around his eyes told a story of a life harder than it should have been. The silence between them was a live wire, humming with years of unspoken words, broken only by the distant wail of sirens outside. "You look like hell," Tommy said finally, his voice rough but laced with something softer. Concern, maybe, or exhaustion. Ryan didn't look up, his gaze fixed on the floorboards as if they held answers he couldn't find. "Feel like it too," he muttered, rubbing a hand over his stubbled jaw. Tommy stepped closer, kicking aside an empty takeout box, and leaned against the wall. "Saw you on the news. Whole damn city's got your name in their mouth." Ryan's head snapped up, eyes flashing with a spark of the old fire. "You here to pile on, Tommy? 'Cause I don't need it." Tommy's lips twitched, not quite a smile. "Nah, just figured you'd be drowning yourself by now." "Looks like I was right." Ryan snorted, a bitter sound that caught in his throat. He wanted to snap back, to shove Tommy out the door and bury himself deeper in the haze, but the weight of his brother's presence anchored him. Tommy had always been the one to see through his bullshit, even when they were kids growing up in the shadow of Mechanicsville, a rough patch of Atlanta where trust was scarce and survival was a daily grind. Ryan had clawed his way out, joined the force, told himself he was making a difference. But now, staring at Tommy's shadowed eyes, he felt the ghosts of that past creeping back. "They're calling me a racist," he said, voice low, testing the word like it might burn. 2 decades on the job, and that's what I get." Tommy didn't flinch, just studied him with a gaze too knowing, too heavy. "You remember that night on Auburn Avenue?" he asked, his tone shifting, sharp enough to cut. Ryan's breath hitched, a memory slamming into him. Tommy, 17, bloodied and bruised, pinned against a wall by a cop who didn't care to ask questions. Ryan had been there, a rookie then, watching from the sidelines, too green to intervene. "Yeah," he said, barely a whisper. "I remember." Tommy nodded, slow and deliberate. "Good, 'cause I do too. Every damn day." Tommy's words hung in the air like smoke, thick and suffocating, curling around Ryan Callahan's conscience as he sat motionless on the couch. The memory of Auburn Avenue burned behind his eyes. Tommy's teenage frame trembling under the weight of a nightstick, the cop's sneer, the way Ryan had stood there, frozen, telling himself it wasn't his fight. He'd buried it deep, locked it away with the justification that he'd been powerless then, just a cog in the machine. But now, with Tommy staring him down, that excuse crumbled like ash. "You didn't do anything," Tommy said, his voice steady but laced with a quiet rage that cut deeper than any shout. "You watched him beat me down, and you walked away. Said it was just how it is." Sound familiar? Ryan's hands clenched into fists, nails digging into his palms. "I was a kid, Tommy. I didn't have a choice." "You had a badge," Tommy shot back, stepping closer, his shadow looming over Ryan. You always had a choice, just like you did in that park with Jackson. The name hit Ryan like a slap, yanking him back to the present. The cuffs on Isaiah's wrists, the venom in his own voice, the boy's shaky video now tearing his life apart. He surged to his feet, chest heaving, and jabbed a finger at Tommy. Don't you dare compare that to this. I was doing my job, keeping people safe. You don't get it. You never did. Tommy didn't budge, his eyes narrowing. Safe from what, Ryan? A guy reading a book? Or safe from someone who looks like me? The question landed like a punch, knocking the wind out of Ryan's defiance. He staggered back, collapsing onto the couch, the fight draining from him as Tommy's words sank in. For the first time, Ryan saw himself through his brother's eyes. Not the hero cop he'd imagined, but a man who'd let assumptions guide his gun hand, who'd turned a blind eye when it mattered most. The whiskey churned in his stomach, threatening to rise as shame clawed its way up his throat. I didn't mean for this, he whispered, staring at his trembling hands. I didn't mean to hurt you, or him. Tommy's expression softened, just a flicker, but he didn't relent. Then why'd you do it? Why'd you assume he was trouble before he even opened his mouth? Ryan had no answer, only the echo of his own voice from the video. People like you, playing on a loop in his head. He'd thought he was protecting the city, but maybe he'd just been protecting his own warped sense of order. The phone on the coffee table buzzed, shattering the silence. Ryan glanced at it, Captain Hayes' number flashing on the screen. Tommy followed his gaze, his voice low. They're calling you in, huh? Guess you've got a choice to make now. Ryan swallowed hard, the weight of the call pressing down on him. He didn't move to answer it, not yet, but he knew Tommy was right. Whatever came next, running wasn't an option anymore. The chaos inside him was a storm he'd have to face, whether he was ready or not. The conference room at the Midtown Atlanta precinct smelled of burnt coffee and old wood, its long table scarred from years of heated debates and spilled frustrations. Officer Ryan Callahan sat at the far end, his hands clasped tightly in his lap, the cuffs of his wrinkled shirt damp with sweat. The overhead lights buzzed faintly, casting a harsh glow on the faces of the review board. 5 stone-faced officers and Captain Lorraine Hayes, who presided at the head of the table like a judge over a tribunal. Ryan's throat felt dry, his pulse hammering as he avoided their gazes, each one a silent accusation. He'd barely slept since Tommy's visit, the memory of their confrontation gnawing at him, mingling with the dread of this moment. This wasn't just a hearing, it was a reckoning, and he knew it. Lorraine cleared her throat, her voice cutting through the stifling air. Officer Callahan, this is your formal disciplinary hearing, she began, her tone clipped and unyielding. You've had time to review the evidence, the body cam, the bystander video, the statements. Now we're here to decide what happens next. She leaned forward, resting her elbows on the table, her dark eyes pinning Ryan in place. Let's start with your account. Walk us through it. Ryan swallowed, his mouth tasting of ash. I was on patrol in Piedmont Park, he said, voice hoarse. We'd had reports of break-ins, male, black, athletic, 30s to 40s. I saw Mr. Jackson sitting alone, no one around, and I thought he looked out of place. My instincts kicked in. A murmur rippled through the board, but Lorraine silenced it with a sharp glance. She tapped a file in front of her, the sound like a gavel. Your instincts, she repeated, her voice dripping with disdain. Those instincts led you to cuff a federal prosecutor without cause. You're aware of that, right? Ryan nodded, his jaw tight. Yes, ma'am. I didn't know who he was. Lorraine's eyes narrowed. That's not the point, Callahan, and you damn well know it. She pressed play on a laptop, and the room filled with the crackle of the park video, Ryan's voice barking. People like you always do. The words echoed off the walls, each syllable a nail in his coffin. Ryan flinched, his hands trembling as the footage stopped. Care to explain that? Lorraine asked, her tone lethal. He opened his mouth, grasping for a defense. It was heat of the moment. I was frustrated. He wasn't cooperating. Before Lorraine could respond, the door creaked open, and Isaiah Jackson stepped inside. The room stilled, all eyes turning to the man in the crisp gray suit, his presence commanding without effort. He didn't sit, just stood near the wall, arms crossed, his gaze locking onto Ryan with a quiet intensity that made the officer's stomach drop. Heat of the moment doesn't justify bias, Isaiah said, his voice low but piercing. You didn't see a man, Officer Callahan. You saw a threat. Why? Ryan's breath caught, Tommy's words echoing in his mind. Safe from someone who looks like me? And for the first time, he had no answer. The silence in the conference room thickened as Isaiah Jackson's question lingered, unanswered, pinning Ryan Callahan to his chair like a specimen under a microscope. His mind raced, grasping for a justification, but every excuse felt hollow against the weight of Isaiah's stare and the damning echo of his own words from the video. Captain Lorraine Hayes leaned back, folding her arms, her expression a mix of exhaustion and resolve. Well, Callahan, she prompted, her voice sharp enough to slice through the haze. We're waiting. Ryan's throat tightened, his eyes darting to the board members, their faces unreadable masks of judgment. I don't know, he admitted finally, the words scraping out like gravel. I saw what I saw and I acted. That's all I've got. A low scoff escaped one of the officers, but Lorraine's glare silenced it. Before she could press further, a soft knock interrupted the tension. The door swung open, revealing Officer Jamal Carter, his nervous energy palpable as he ushered in an unexpected figure, a boy no older than 10, clutching a phone in his small hands. His wide eyes darted around the room, landing on Ryan with a flicker of fear. Lorraine's brow furrowed. Jamal, what's this? She demanded. Jamal cleared his throat. This is DeAndre Harris, ma'am. He's the one who shot the video. Said he wanted to speak. Ryan's heart sank, a cold sweat breaking out across his back. The kid from the park. He hadn't even registered him that day, too blinded by his own tunnel vision. DeAndre stepped forward, his voice trembling, but clear. I was playing near the fountain when it happened, he said, glancing at Isaiah, then Ryan. I saw him, the officer, yelling. He looked mad, real mad, and Mr. Jackson wasn't even doing nothing. It scared me because my cousin got stopped like that once, and he didn't come home for a week. The room went still, the boy's words a quiet thunderclap that reverberated through every corner. Ryan's chest caved, a choke sound escaping his lips as tears stung his eyes. He saw Tommy in that moment, bruised and broken on Auburn Avenue, and now this kid, another echo of a past he couldn't outrun. Isaiah's gaze softened, just for a second, but he said nothing, letting the weight settle. Lorraine exhaled sharply, rubbing her temples before fixing Ryan with a steely look. You've got two paths, Callahan, she said, her voice firm but not unkind. Option 1, you resign, walk away, and this ends here. Option 2, you stay, but it's not a free pass. Mandatory retraining, bias workshops, de-escalation courses, the works. Probation for a year, one slip, and you're gone. Ryan blinked, the choice a lifeline and a noose all at once. He nodded slowly, voice barely audible. I'll stay. Lorraine studied him, then glanced at Isaiah, who gave a subtle nod. Dismissed, she said, but as Ryan rose, Isaiah's voice stopped him. This isn't forgiveness, officer. It's a chance. Don't waste it. Ryan stumbled out, the boy's words and Isaiah's warning trailing him like shadows, a fragile hope flickering beneath the wreckage. The Atlanta Police Training Center stood like a monolith on the city's south side, its sleek glass facade reflecting the gray dawn sky. Inside, the air hummed with the sterile hum of fluorescent lights and the faint echo of footsteps on polished floors. Ryan Callahan sat in a classroom near the back, his hands folded tightly on the desk, the crisp lines of his newly pressed uniform feeling foreign against his skin. A week had passed since the hearing, 7 days of sleepless nights haunted by DeAndre's trembling voice and Isaiah Jackson's piercing warning. The precinct had given him a choice, quit or fight, and he'd chosen the latter, though the weight of that decision pressed down like a stone. Today was day 1 of his mandatory retraining, and every fiber of his being screamed to bolt from the room. The instructor, a wiry man named Dr. Ellis Pierce, paced at the front, his voice sharp and deliberate as he addressed the dozen officers in attendance. Implicit bias isn't a buzzword, he said, clicking through a presentation slide titled Unconscious Assumptions. It's a lens, distorted, automatic, and damn near universal. Your job is to recognize it, question it, and override it. Ryan's jaw tightened, his eyes fixed on the screen as images flashed. A black man in a hoodie labeled threat, a white man in a suit labeled safe. Pierce paused, his gaze sweeping the room. How many of you have made a split-second call based on that lens? Be honest. Hands stayed down, but Ryan felt the heat creeping up his neck. He didn't raise his. He couldn't. But the memory of Piedmont Park burned in his mind, Isaiah's calm defiance clashing with his own reckless certainty. Pierce moved on, his tone softening but no less insistent. Today we start with awareness. You can't fix what you don't see. He handed out worksheets, scenarios, questions, blank spaces for reflection. Ryan stared at his, the first prompt glaring up at him. Describe a time your instincts led you astray. His pen hovered, trembling slightly before he scrawled a single line. I arrested a man for reading a book. The words looked stark on the page, a confession he couldn't dodge. Around him, officers scribbled or fidgeted, some whispering, others glaring at him sidelong. He was the pariah now, the cautionary tale. Pierce circled back, peering over Ryan's shoulder. Good start, he said quietly. Keep digging. Ryan nodded, but the knot in his chest tightened. Digging meant facing Tommy's bloodied face. DeAndre's fear, the years he'd spent trusting a gut he now doubted. The session shifted to a lecture on de-escalation. Pierce outlining steps, pause, assess, communicate, that felt like a foreign language to Ryan. He'd always acted fast, relied on authority to control a scene. Now they were asking him to slow down, to think. As the clock ticked toward noon, Pierce announced a break, and Ryan slumped in his seat, the worksheet crumpled in his fist. He wasn't sure he could do this, not yet, but walking away meant proving them all right, and that, he decided, wasn't an option. The training room buzzed with low chatter as the break ended, officers shuffling back to their seats with styrofoam cups of lukewarm coffee. Ryan Callahan stayed rooted to his chair, the crumpled worksheet still clutched in his hand, its edges damp from his sweaty grip. Dr. Ellis Pierce clapped his hands, drawing the group's attention. All right, folks, time to put theory into practice, he said, a glint of challenge in his eyes. We're doing a simulation, real-time decision-making. Pair up. Ryan's stomach lurched as the room shifted, officers pairing off with practiced ease. He sat alone, the odd man out, until Pierce pointed at him. Callahan, you're with me. Ryan nodded stiffly, rising to follow the instructor to a corner where a makeshift scenario awaited. A table, a chair, and a volunteer in civilian clothes. The volunteer turned, and Ryan froze. The man wasn't Isaiah Jackson, but the resemblance was uncanny. Tall, black, mid-40s, dressed in a button-down shirt, a book in his hand. Pierce leaned in, his voice low. You're on patrol. You see him sitting alone in a park? No reports, no complaints? What do you do? Ryan's mouth went dry, the memory of Piedmont Park crashing over him like a wave. The cuffs, the shouts, the boy's phone. He took a shaky breath, stepping forward. Afternoon, sir, he said, forcing his tone to stay even. The volunteer glanced up, his expression neutral. Afternoon, officer. Just reading. Ryan hesitated, his old instinct screaming threat. Check him, control it, but Pierce's words echoed louder. Pause, assess, communicate. That's a good book, he managed, nodding at the prop. Mind if I ask how long you've been here? The volunteer shrugged. About an hour. Ryan nodded, his hands twitching at his sides, fighting the urge to demand ID. All right, enjoy your day. He stepped back, turning to Pierce, who watched with a raised brow. Better, Pierce said, scribbling a note. But you're still tense. Your body's saying you don't trust him. Why? Ryan's shoulders slumped, the question cutting too close. I don't know, he lied. But the truth clawed at him. He'd seen a ghost of Isaiah, of Tommy, of every assumption he'd never questioned. Pierce clapped him on the back. That's what we're here to figure out. Sit down. Ryan returned to his seat, legs trembling as the simulation replayed in his mind. He'd walked away this time. No cuffs, no confrontation. But it felt wrong, unnatural, like shedding a skin he'd worn too long. The session dragged on, Pierce dissecting each pair's choices, but Ryan barely heard it. His eyes kept drifting to the worksheet, the line he'd written. I arrested a man for reading a book. Now a jagged scar on the page. As the clock hit 5, Pierce dismissed them, and Ryan lingered, staring at the empty room. He wasn't fixed, not even close. But something had shifted, a crack in the armor he'd built over decades. He tucked the worksheet into his pocket, a quiet resolve settling in. Whatever came next, he'd face it, because running from this meant running from himself. The rain fell in a soft, steady drizzle over Atlanta's midtown, cloaking the streets in a shimmering haze as night crept in. Ryan Callahan trudged along Peachtree Street, his boots splashing through shallow puddles, the collar of his jacket turned up against the damp chill. 2 weeks into his retraining, and the world still felt off-kilter. Every glance from a passerby, a judgment. Every siren in the distance, a reminder of the badge he wasn't sure he deserved anymore. He'd skipped the precinct's usual haunts, the bars where cops traded war stories over cheap beer, and opted for a quiet coffee shop instead. The Bellwood Brew sat tucked between a bookstore and a laundromat, its warm light spilling onto the wet pavement like a beacon. Ryan pushed through the door, the bell jangling above him, and shook the rain from his hair as he scanned the room. The place was half empty, a scattering of late-night regulars hunched over laptops or nursing mugs in the corners. Ryan ordered a black coffee, his voice gruff from disuse, and slid into a booth near the window. He was halfway through his first sip, the bitter heat grounding him, when the door chimed again. He glanced up and froze. Isaiah Jackson stood there, his gray overcoat speckled with rain, a briefcase in one hand. Their eyes locked across the room, a jolt of recognition sparking between them. Ryan's grip tightened on his mug, the ceramic creaking under his fingers, as Isaiah hesitated, then made his way over with a stride too purposeful to be casual. Officer Callahan, Isaiah said, his voice low and steady, the same tone that had cut through the hearing room. Ryan nodded stiffly, forcing his jaw to unclench. Mr. Jackson. Isaiah slid into the seat across from him without asking, setting his briefcase on the table with a soft thud. Didn't expect to see you here, he said, his gaze unwavering, searching Ryan's face for something. Guilt, defiance, maybe both. Ryan shrugged, the motion jerky. Needed a break from everything. Isaiah's lips twitched, not quite a smile. Everything meaning me? Ryan's breath caught, the weight of the question pressing down. No, he lied, then backtracked. Maybe. I don't know. He set the mug down, his hands trembling slightly, and met Isaiah's eyes. Look, I'm sorry. For the park. For all of it. I know that doesn't fix anything. Isaiah leaned back, folding his arms, his expression unreadable. Sorry's a start, he said, his tone cool but not cruel. But it's not enough. You know that, right? Ryan nodded, the words from his training worksheet flashing in his mind. I arrested a man for reading a book. Yeah, he said, voice rough. I'm figuring that out. Isaiah studied him for a long moment, then exhaled. Good, because I'm not here to hear apologies. I'm here to see what you do next. Ryan's brow furrowed, confusion flickering through the guilt. But before he could respond, the air outside shifted. Shouts, footsteps, the murmur of a crowd forming in the rain. The muffled shouts outside the Bellwood Brew grew louder, pulling Ryan Callahan's attention from Isaiah Jackson's steady gaze to the rain-streaked window. Shadows moved in the dim streetlight, a dozen figures, maybe more, their voices rising in a chaotic swell. No justice, no peace. The words cut through the drizzle, sharp and insistent, and Ryan's gut twisted as he recognized the rhythm of a protest. He turned back to Isaiah, whose expression had shifted, still calm, but now tinged with a weary resignation. They're out there because of you, Isaiah said, his voice low, almost conversational. Because of what you did. Ryan flinched, the accusation landing like a stone, but he didn't argue. He couldn't. The video, the headlines, the chants, they were all threads in a web he'd spun himself. The door burst open, the bell jangling wildly as 3 young men stormed in, their hoodies soaked, eyes blazing with anger. The tallest one spotted Ryan instantly, his face twisting into a snarl. "That's him," he shouted, pointing a trembling finger. "That's the cop from the park." The room stilled, every head swiveling toward the booth. Ryan's heart slammed against his ribs, his training kicking in. Assess, de-escalate. But his hands stayed frozen on the table. The group advanced, the leader's voice rising. "You think you can just sit here like nothing happened? You put a man in cuffs for nothing." The barista shouted for them to leave, but the words drowned in the escalating fury. Ryan opened his mouth, a stammered, "I'm sorry," on his lips, but it felt pitiful against their rage. Isaiah stood abruptly, his chair scraping the floor, and stepped between Ryan and the trio with a fluid authority that silenced the room. "Enough," he said, his voice a quiet thunder that carried more weight than the shouts. The leader blinked, recognition dawning. You're him, the guy he arrested?" Isaiah nodded, unflinching. "Yeah, and I'm telling you to stand down. This isn't the way." The young man hesitated, his fists unclenching, but his glare stayed fixed on Ryan. "He doesn't deserve to just walk away," he spat. Isaiah's eyes flicked to Ryan, then back. "He's not walking away. He's facing it. Let him." The tension hung, brittle and electric, until the leader muttered a curse and turned, his friends following him out into the rain. Ryan exhaled, his breath ragged, as Isaiah sat back down. "Why'd you do that?" he asked, voice barely above a whisper. Isaiah shrugged, a faint smile tugging at his lips. "Because I've seen enough fights. And because I meant what I said, you've got to figure out what's next." Ryan nodded, the weight of the moment settling deep. "I owe you," he said, and for once it wasn't just words. Isaiah waved it off. "Prove it outside these walls. That's what matters." The chants faded into the night, but the encounter lingered, a spark of something new flickering in Ryan's chest. Gratitude, maybe, or the first real glimmer of resolve. The streets of Atlanta's West End hummed with a restless pulse as dusk painted the sky in streaks of amber and gray. Ryan Callahan adjusted the straps of his patrol vest, the weight of it familiar yet heavier than he remembered, as he stepped out of his cruiser onto the cracked pavement of a neighborhood he'd once known like the back of his hand. It had been a month since the hearing, 3 weeks since his retraining began, and tonight marked his first shift back on duty. Probationary supervised, a test of everything he'd been forced to unlearn. The air carried the scent of barbecue from a nearby stoop and the faint tang of exhaust, a mix of life and struggle that defined this stretch of the city. Ryan's boots echoed against the sidewalk, his eyes scanning the shadows, but his mind was on Isaiah Jackson's words from the coffee shop. "Prove it outside these walls." He hadn't told anyone about that night, not Tommy, not Captain Hayes, but it clung to him like a second skin, a quiet push against the instincts that had once ruled him. The radio crackled at his hip, dispatching minor calls, noise complaints, a lost dog. But the streets felt alive with a tension he couldn't shake. West End was a powder keg, its residents wary of uniforms after years of heavy-handed policing, and Ryan's face was no stranger here, plastered across newsstands and TV screens. He kept his head down, sticking to the route laid out by his supervisor, Officer Lena Brooks, who trailed a block behind in her own car, watching, always watching. Halfway down Lee Street, he spotted him, a young man, maybe 20, leaning against a lamppost, his hoodie pulled low, hands in his pockets. The scene mirrored Piedmont Park too closely, black, alone, unassuming. Ryan's old self flared to life. Check him, he's hiding something, but he clenched his fists, forcing the thought back. Pause, assess, communicate. He took a breath, approaching slowly, his voice steady but softer than it would have been a month ago. "Evening," he said, stopping a few feet away. The kid glanced up, eyes narrowing with suspicion, but didn't move. "Evening," he echoed, his tone guarded. Ryan nodded toward the street. "Just passing through. You good?" The kid shrugged, shifting his weight. "Yeah, waiting for my sister." Ryan's hands stayed loose at his sides, resisting the itch to demand ID, to escalate. "All right, stay safe out here." He turned to walk away, heart pounding, when the kid called after him. "You're that cop, aren't you? The one from the park?" Ryan froze, turning back slowly. The kid's stare was hard, but curious too, like he was testing the waters. Yeah, Ryan admitted, voice low. That's me. The kid nodded, a flicker of something, maybe doubt, maybe hope, crossing his face before he looked away. Ryan resumed his patrol, the exchange lingering, a small victory shadowed by the weight of what might have been. The streetlights flickered on as Ryan Callahan moved deeper into West End, the encounter with the kid on Lee Street replaying in his mind like a loop he couldn't pause. His boots scuffed against the uneven sidewalk, each step a quiet testament to the restraint he'd fought to muster. A month ago, he'd have pressed that kid, demanded ID, searched his pockets, turned a nothing moment into a standoff. Now he'd walked away, and the weight of that choice felt both liberating and fragile, like a thread that could snap under scrutiny. The radio crackled again, Officer Lena Brooks's voice cutting through. Callahan, status? He pressed the button at his shoulder, keeping his tone even. All clear, just routine. Her reply was curt. Keep it that way. But he caught the faint edge of approval, a lifeline he clung to as the night stretched on. He rounded a corner onto Ralph David Abernathy Boulevard, the street alive with the hum of evening, cars rolling by, a group of teens laughing outside a bodega, the distant thump of bass from an open window. Ryan's eyes caught a glint across the road. A woman leaning against a parked car, her phone angled toward him, the red dot of a recording light unmistakable. Maya Torres. He recognized her instantly, the journalist who'd turned his life into a headline, her dark hair pulled back, her gaze sharp even from a distance. His stomach clenched, but he kept walking, pretending not to notice. She'd seen the exchange on Lee Street, he was sure of it, and part of him braced for the inevitable spin. Disgraced cop plays nice for cameras. Yet another part, smaller but growing, hoped she'd caught something real. Maya lowered her phone as he passed, her voice calling out, calm but insistent. Officer Callahan, got a minute? Ryan stopped, turning slowly, his jaw tight. Not really, he said, but he didn't walk away. She stepped closer, unfazed. I saw what you did back there. No cuffs, no hassle. That's not the guy from Piedmont Park. Ryan's throat tightened, her words a mirror he wasn't ready to face. Maybe I'm trying to be different, he said, quieter than he meant. Maya tilted her head, studying him. Trying's a start. We'll see if it sticks. She tapped her phone, a faint smile tugging at her lips. This hits the Chronicle tomorrow. People might like it, or they might not. Ryan nodded, the weight of her words settling in. Do what you gotta do. As Maya walked off, disappearing into the night, Ryan felt the eyes of West End on him. Real or imagined, it didn't matter. The kid's question echoed, You're that cop, aren't you? And for the first time, he didn't want to run from it. He glanced back toward Lee Street, then resumed his patrol, a quiet resolve hardening in his chest. Lena's cruiser rolled past a block away, her silhouette a silent witness. But Ryan knew this test wasn't hers to grade. It was his, and the city's, and maybe even Isaiah's. Whatever came next, he'd face it head-on. The auditorium at the Atlanta Civic Center buzzed with restless energy, its high ceilings amplifying the murmur of hundreds of voices packed into the rows of seats. The air smelled of coffee and anticipation, the stage bathed in the harsh glow of spotlights as banners fluttered overhead. Community and accountability, rebuilding trust. It was a citywide conference on police reform, spurred by weeks of protests and headlines, and tonight's panel was the main event. Ryan Callahan sat backstage, his hands clasped tightly in his lap, the crisp lines of his dress uniform feeling like a costume he hadn't earned. Sweat beaded at his brow despite the cool air, his pulse racing as he peeked through the curtain at the sea of faces, activists, reporters, civilians, and a scattering of cops, some familiar, some glaring with quiet disdain. Captain Lorraine Hayes had insisted he be here, her voice firm over the phone. You started this, Callahan. You're part of it now. Maya Torres's article from his West End patrol had hit the Chronicle that morning. A cop's second chance, redemption or PR. And the response was a wildfire online, split between cautious praise and scathing skepticism. Ryan hadn't wanted the spotlight, But Lorraine saw it as a chance to show progress, to put a face on the department's push for change. He'd agreed reluctantly because Isaiah Jackson's words still echoed in his skull. Prove it outside these walls. Now, as the moderator called his name, Ryan stepped onto the stage, the applause tepid, punctuated by a few sharp boos that stung like nettles. Isaiah Jackson sat at the panel table, his gray suit impeccable, his presence a quiet anchor amid the storm. Beside him were a community organizer, a retired chief, and a professor, but all eyes seemed to drift between Isaiah and Ryan as he took his seat. The moderator, a wiry man with a clipped voice, wasted no time. Officer Callahan, you've become a symbol. Some say of bias, others of reform. Tell us why you're here. Ryan swallowed, his mouth dry, and leaned into the mic. I'm here because I screwed up, he said, voice rough but steady. I arrested Mr. Jackson in Piedmont Park for no reason but my own assumptions. I've spent 20 years trusting my gut, and it was wrong. Wrong about him, wrong about a lot of things. A murmur rippled through the crowd, surprise mingling with suspicion. He glanced at Isaiah, who watched him with that same unreadable gaze from the coffee shop. I've been retraining, Ryan continued, learning to question what I see, to slow down. Last week I walked away from a kid in West End who I'd have stopped before. It's not enough, not yet, but it's where I'm at. The room shifted, some nodding, others whispering, as the moderator turned to Isaiah. Mr. Jackson, your thoughts? Isaiah leaned forward, his voice calm but resonant. He's right. It's not enough, but it's a start. The question is what comes next. Ryan nodded, bracing himself as the tension in the room coiled tighter, a storm about to break. The auditorium's tension snapped like a taut wire as Isaiah Jackson's words hung in the air. His question, what comes next? A challenge that reverberated through the crowd. Ryan Callahan shifted in his seat, the mic still hot in front of him, his mind racing for an answer he didn't fully have. Before he could speak, a commotion erupted near the back. Shouts, the scrape of chairs, a group of 6 men in dark jackets surging toward the stage. Their voices cut through the murmurs, raw and furious. He doesn't belong here. Fire him. The leader, a broad-shouldered man with a shaved head, pointed at Ryan, his face twisted with contempt. You don't get to play hero after what you did. The room erupted, some cheering the outburst, others shouting them down, as security scrambled to intercept. Ryan's chest tightened, his hands gripping the table's edge, the instinct to bolt warring with the resolve he'd been clawing toward. He'd faced angry crowds before, but this was different. This was personal, a mirror of every doubt he'd wrestled with since Piedmont Park. The moderator stammered into the mic, calling for calm, but the chaos swelled until Isaiah stood, his movements swift and commanding. He raised a hand, his voice booming over the din. Sit down! The authority in his tone sliced through the noise, startling the protesters into a stunned pause. They hovered mid-step, glaring as Isaiah stepped around the table, positioning himself between Ryan and the group. You want to yell? Yell at me, he said, his gaze locking onto the leader. I'm the one he cuffed, and I'm telling you, he's here because I asked him to be. The room hushed, a collective breath held as the words sank in. Ryan blinked, shock rippling through him. Isaiah hadn't asked him directly, not like that, but the lie carried a truth deeper than fact. The leader faltered, his fists unclenching. You're defending him? He spat, incredulous. Isaiah shook his head. I'm not defending what he did. I'm saying he's trying to fix it. You want change? This is where it starts. Messy, ugly, real. You don't get it by running him out. The protesters hesitated, then retreated under security's nudge, the crowd settling into an uneasy silence, punctuated by scattered applause. Ryan stared at Isaiah, gratitude and confusion knotting in his throat as the prosecutor sat back down. The moderator regained control, steering the panel forward, but Ryan barely heard the next questions. Isaiah's move had shifted something. Saved him, yes, but also bound them together in this fractured moment. As the session ended, the applause swelled, louder now, a mix of hope and skepticism washing over them. Ryan met Isaiah's eyes, a silent nod passing between them, and felt the weight of that question again. What comes next? He didn't know, not fully, but for the first time, he believed he could find out. The stage lights dimmed, but the spotlight on their path only grew brighter. The late morning sun filtered through the blinds of Captain Lorraine Hayes' office, casting thin stripes of light across the hardwood floor. The room felt smaller today, the air thick with the weight of choices yet to be made. Ryan Callahan stood near the window, his hands clasped behind his back, the crisp lines of his uniform a stark contrast to the exhaustion etched into his face. 2 days had passed since the conference at the Civic Center. 2 days since Isaiah Jackson had stood between him and a mob, turning chaos into a fragile bridge. The memory of that moment clung to him, a lifeline he hadn't expected. And now he faced Lorraine across her desk, her dark eyes studying him with a mix of scrutiny and something softer. Hope, maybe, or faith. Lorraine leaned back in her chair, a file open in front of her, its pages detailing Ryan's retraining, his West End patrol, the panel's aftermath. "You've made it through probation so far," she said, her voice steady but edged with caution. "No slip-ups, no complaints. Brooks says you're listening, learning. The Chronicle piece didn't hurt either. People are watching, Callahan, and some are starting to believe you might actually change." Ryan nodded, his throat tight. "I'm trying, Captain. Every damn day." She tapped the file, her expression hardening. "Trying's good, but it's not enough. I've got a proposition, something bigger. I want you to lead a training program. Bias workshops, de-escalation, community outreach. You'd be the face of it." Ryan's breath caught, the offer hitting him like a punch he hadn't seen coming. "Me?" he asked, voice rough with disbelief. "After everything I've done?" Lorraine's lips pressed into a thin line. "Because of everything you've done. You've been on both sides, screwed up royally, then clawed your way back. That's a story people need to hear, especially the rookies coming up." He stared at her, the weight of it sinking in. Lead a program. Teach others what he learned the hard way. Turn his shame into something useful. It was a chance to prove Isaiah right, to make good on that night at the coffee shop, but it also meant stepping into a spotlight he'd spent weeks trying to escape. Before he could respond, the door creaked open, and Isaiah Jackson stepped inside, his gray suit impeccable as always, a faint smile tugging at his lips. "Heard I was needed," he said, nodding to Lorraine before fixing his gaze on Ryan. "She told me about the idea, said it hinges on you." Ryan's pulse quickened, the room shrinking further as Isaiah's presence filled it. "And you're okay with this?" he asked, searching Isaiah's face for a trace of doubt. Isaiah shrugged, his voice calm but firm. "Not my call to make, but if you're in, I've got a condition. You don't do this alone. I supervise. We work together." Ryan blinked, the proposal a curveball that left him reeling, teetering on the edge of a decision that could redefine everything. Ryan Callahan's mind spun as Isaiah Jackson's condition hung in the air. The idea of working together, a lifeline laced with thorns. He glanced between Isaiah and Captain Lorraine Hayes, the office walls pressing in as the gravity of the moment settled over him. "Together?" he echoed, his voice rough, testing the word like it might break. Isaiah nodded, stepping closer, his eyes steady and unyielding. "Yeah, you lead the training, I oversee it. Make sure it's real, not just some PR stunt. And we take it to the streets, meet the people who've been hurt by the system. You ready for that?" Ryan's jaw tightened, the memory of West End flashing, the kid's guarded stare, Maya's camera, the weight of eyes he couldn't shake. This was bigger, rawer, a leap into waters he'd barely learned to navigate. Lorraine watched them, her fingers drumming lightly on the desk. "It's a risk," she said, her tone frank. "You'll get pushback, from the brass, from the streets, from your own guys. But if it works, it could change things. Really change them." Ryan exhaled, running a hand through his hair, the offer pulling him in two directions, safety and retreat or redemption through fire. He thought of Tommy, bloodied on Auburn Avenue, of DeAndre's trembling voice, of Isaiah standing between him and a mob. "All right," he said finally, the word heavy but resolute. "I'm in. But yeah, together." Isaiah's faint smile widened slightly, a rare crack in his armor. Good. Let's start with the hard part. An hour later, Ryan stood on a cracked stoop in Mechanicsville, the neighborhood where he'd grown up, where Tommy still lived. Isaiah stood beside him, hands in his pockets, as a small crowd gathered. Residents, some familiar, some hostile, their faces a gallery of skepticism and pain. Ryan cleared his throat, his voice carrying over the murmurs. "I'm Officer Callahan," he began, forcing himself to meet their eyes. "A month ago, I arrested a man, Mr. Jackson here, for nothing but my own bias. I was wrong. I've been wrong before, here too, and I'm sorry." The words burned, but he pressed on. "I'm here to listen, to learn, to do better. Ask me anything." A woman in the front, her arms crossed, stepped forward, voice sharp. "Why should we trust you now?" Ryan faltered, then felt Isaiah's steady presence beside him. "You shouldn't. Not yet," he said, "but I'm asking for a chance to earn it." The questions came fast, angry, raw, some forgiving, some not. Ryan answered what he could, took the hits he couldn't, Isaiah stepping in when the crowd pressed too hard. An old man, his voice shaky, spoke of a son lost to a bad stop. A teenager glared, saying nothing. Ryan felt every word, every stare, a mirror of his past and a map to his future. As the sun dipped low, the crowd thinned, a few nodding, a few walking away. Isaiah clapped him on the shoulder. "That's step one," he said. "Keep going." Ryan nodded, drained but lighter, the path ahead clearer and harder than ever. A year had passed since that fateful afternoon in Piedmont Park, and the October sun once again bathed Atlanta in a golden glow, its warmth filtering through the towering oaks that lined the park's northern edge. The air buzzed with voices, hundreds of them, gathered around a makeshift stage near the same bench where Ryan Callahan had cuffed Isaiah Jackson. Today, that spot was transformed. A podium stood at its center, flanked by banners reading "Healing Through Action" and "1 Year Later." Ryan adjusted his tie, the crisp blue of his uniform catching the light as he stood backstage, peering out at the crowd. Residents, activists, officers, and reporters, their faces a tapestry of curiosity and cautious hope. His hands trembled slightly, not from fear, but from the weight of what this moment meant. Isaiah Jackson stood beside him, his gray suit impeccable, a quiet strength radiating from him as he scanned the scene. The past year had forged an unlikely partnership between them. Countless hours in training rooms, tense community meetings, late nights rewriting policies. They'd faced resistance, angry cops, skeptical crowds, even threats. But they'd pushed forward, step by grueling step. Today was the culmination, a public forum to unveil new department protocols on bias and de-escalation, co-authored by Ryan and Isaiah, and a chance to close a chapter that had begun with a mistake. Ryan caught Isaiah's eye, a silent question passing between them. "You ready?" Isaiah asked, his voice low but steady. Ryan nodded, exhaling. "Yeah, let's do this." The crowd hushed as they stepped onto the stage, the murmur giving way to a ripple of applause. Stronger than at the Civic Center, warmer too. Ryan took the podium first, clearing his throat as the mic hummed to life. "A year ago, I stood right here and made the worst call of my career," he began, his voice rough but clear. "I arrested Mr. Jackson for no reason but my own bias. I thought I was doing my job, but I was wrong. Wrong about him, wrong about myself." He paused, meeting the eyes of the crowd, some familiar from Mechanicsville, some new. "I've spent this year trying to fix that, not just for me, but for this city. Today's about accountability, mine, ours, and moving forward together." The applause swelled, punctuated by a few shouts of support, and Ryan stepped back, yielding the mic to Isaiah. Isaiah's presence commanded the space, his words measured but resonant. "This isn't about erasing the past," he said, gesturing to the bench behind them. "It's about learning from it. These new policies, mandatory bias training, stricter oversight, community input, they're a start, but they only work if we all commit." He glanced at Ryan, a faint smile breaking through. "Officer Callahan's not the man he was a year ago. Neither am I. That's where change begins." The crowd cheered, a wave of sound that washed over them. But Ryan's eyes caught a figure at the edge. Tommy, standing tall, his expression unreadable. The applause faded into a hush as Isaiah Jackson stepped back from the podium, leaving the stage bathed in a golden silence that felt both fragile and profound. Ryan Callahan's gaze lingered on Tommy at the crowd's edge, his younger brother's presence a quiet thunder in the storm of the day. Captain Lorraine Hayes joined them now, her broad frame steady as she took the mic to outline the new policies, transparency measures, body cam audits, a civilian review board. But Ryan barely heard her. His eyes locked with Tommy's, and in that moment, the year's weight crashed into him. Every workshop, every apology, every step toward this park. Then unexpectedly, Tommy moved, weaving through the crowd until he reached the stage's steps, his jaw tight but his stride resolute. Lorraine paused, sensing the shift, and gestured for Tommy to come up. The crowd stirred, whispers rippling as he climbed onto the platform, stopping beside Ryan. "I wasn't going to do this," Tommy said, his voice rough, unamplified but carrying to the front rows. "But I need to." He turned to Ryan, eyes glistening with something raw, pain, pride, forgiveness. "You remember Auburn Avenue? That night you stood by while I got beat down? I hated you for it." For years, Ryan's breath hitched, his chest caving as the memory surged. Tommy, 17, bloodied, his silence louder than any scream. "But a year ago," Tommy continued, "you did it again. Cuffed a man who didn't deserve it. I thought that was you, forever. I was wrong." The crowd leaned in, the air electric as Tommy's voice broke. "You've been my brother, but you've also been my ghost. Today I see you trying, really trying. I forgive you, Ryan, for Auburn, for everything." Tears streaked Tommy's face, and Ryan's own vision blurred as he pulled his brother into a fierce hug, the stage trembling beneath them. The crowd erupted, cheers and sobs mingling, a wave of release that shook the park. Isaiah stepped forward, resting a hand on Ryan's shoulder, and whispered, "That's what this is for." Ryan nodded, unable to speak, the knot in his throat unraveling into something lighter. As Tommy stepped back, Isaiah took the mic one last time. "One more thing," he said, his voice steady but warm. "We're launching a fund, named for those we've lost to injustice, to support victims and train officers. It starts here, with us." The applause roared again, and Ryan and Isaiah shook hands, their grip firm, a promise sealed under the oaks. The sun dipped lower, casting long shadows across the bench where it all began. And as the crowd dispersed, Ryan lingered with Tommy and Isaiah, the golden light wrapping them in a quiet peace. Change wasn't perfect. It never would be. But it was real, rooted in this moment, in this park. They walked off together, the echoes of their steps a testament to a journey not finished, but finally begun.